2026 is turning into a lost year for Russia. That is not a hope and it is not a guess. It is a conclusion that comes straight out of the numbers, and I want to walk you through exactly how I get there, because the picture only makes sense once you stop looking at single days and start looking at the trend line underneath them. Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Before anything else, I want to be honest about something. There are a lot of people covering this war, working from the same open source data I use, who end up telling you completely different stories. Some look at the fact that the war is still grinding on day after day and conclude that this alone is already a defeat for Ukraine. I understand that instinct, and there is truth in it. Every additional day of fighting is a tragedy, and it would be better if none of this were happening at all. Others zoom in tactically. They watch Russia grind forward a village here, a tree line there, they count the dead on the Ukrainian side, and they conclude that Ukraine is simply losing slowly. I take a different view, not because I am ignoring the tactical picture, but because I think the tactical picture is the wrong altitude to judge this war from. Ukraine isn't fighting for any single village, it's fighting a civilizational war of attrition against an empire that needs a win it clearly cannot get. Looked at from that altitude, 2026 has been a disaster for Moscow, and I want to show you why piece by piece. Start with the casualty numbers, because they anchor everything else. Russian losses in July came in at roughly 42,600 confirmed and estimated casualties for the month. That is an enormous figure on its own, but what matters more is the shape of the curve. Since January month over month, Russian losses have been climbing, not by huge jumps, but steadily, somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 additional casualties every month. That is not a spike caused by one battle. That is a system bleeding out at an accelerating rate. Ukrainian officials have talked for a while about a threshold, somewhere near 50,000 a month, at which point Russia's ability to keep feeding infantry into these assaults starts to genuinely buckle. We are not there yet, but the trajectory is pointed directly at that number, and it has been 4 months. Now compare that cost against what Russia is actually getting for it. Look at the weekly territorial data from independent frontline trackers over roughly the last 5 to 6 weeks. Russian net gains have been running at something like 1-2 kilometers a day across the entire front, and in at least one of those weeks, the net movement was negative, meaning Ukraine clawed back more ground than Russia took. Set that next to 2025, when the red areas on the map were expanding at a genuinely alarming pace, and the contrast is stark. The line represents captured territory has essentially gone flat. But here's the part that should worry the Kremlin more than the map itself: the number of Russian assaults, the actual attempted attacks. Along the line has not gone flat, it has spiked hard since May. Russia is throwing more attacks at the Ukrainian line than it has in a long time and getting almost nothing for it. That combination, rising attack volume and flat territorial results, is the signature of an army that has run out of good options and is substituting volume for effectiveness. It is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of desperation dressed up as pressure. Break it down by sector and the pattern holds. In the south, Russia tried to execute a flanking maneuver, pushing east to west to try to unhinge the southern defensive line. Ukraine answered with a series of counterattacks along a wide front designed to cut into that Russian movement, and by most recent reporting it worked well enough that Russian command appears to have quietly shifted from offensive to defensive posture in that sector. That is a significant admission for an army that spent the spring talking about renewed offensives around Lyman, which matters because it's a gateway toward the fortress cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Russia tried a partial encirclement. Ukrainian forces pushed back from both the south and, by newer reports, from the north as well, cutting off the routes Russia needed to make that envelopment work. The town has not been updated on every open source map yet, but the reporting from multiple independent monitors lines up, and the trend is that Russia's options around Lyman have narrowed rather than widened. The two places where Russia has actually moved the needle are Rodensky, just behind Pokrovsk, and the ongoing struggle around Kostyant and Ivica. Rodensky gives Russia a bit of extension off their earlier breakthrough line, but it runs straight into what's being called the new Donbas defensive line, a belt of Ukrainian fortifications, built specifically to catch this kind of follow-on push. And remember, this is the same dynamic we heard after Bakhmut fell. Analysts warned that a floodgate was about to open, and it never did. Kostyant and Ivica is the more interesting case because it shows how badly modern frontline reporting can be misread. Russian channels post footage from the outskirts and declare the town captured. It isn't. What's actually happening is that Kostyant and Ivica has become heavily contested gray zone, with Russian forces present in something like 90% of the urban area and Ukrainian forces present in around 70% of it. Both figures being high at once tells you the real story. This isn't a captured city, it's a city where both sides are operating block by block, sometimes street by street. Earlier this year I said that if Russia failed to take Kostyant and Ivica before the end of July, that would mark a real failure of their broader 2026 ambitions in Donbas. Those ambitions required approaching the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk-Druzhkivka cluster from the north, east, and south simultaneously. The northern push failed, the eastern push failed, the southern push is failing. Kostyant and Ivica was the one axis where they were making real progress, and Ukrainian reinforcements have now stalled that. 2. Russia isn't just missing its stated goals. It hasn't even completed the setup phase for the more modest, scaled-down goals analysts assumed were realistic. But the map alone still undersells how bad this is for Russia, because the map doesn't show what's underneath it. For most of this war, from 2022 through roughly the middle of 2025, Ukraine had a real and well-documented problem with building fortifications. There were repeated scandals, including entire sectors near Kharkov where planned defensive lines simply never got built before Russian forces arrived. That has changed dramatically. Fortification trackers who have historically been critical of Ukraine's engineering effort now report more than 3,800 kilometers of new defensive works completed nationwide this year, and for the first time since the invasion began, the overall state of Ukrainian fortifications is being described as genuinely adequate. That is not a phrase these analysts have used lightly before. What makes this newer generation of fortifications especially dangerous for Russia is the design philosophy behind it. Rather than a single defensive line that can be breached and then bypassed, engineers have built what's effectively a checkerboard system tied to drone coverage. When Russian infiltration is detected in one grid square, that square and the ones around it light up as coordinated kill zones, saturated with drone strikes. It means there is no such thing anymore as breaking through and then having open ground behind it. Every advance runs into another layer of exactly the same problem. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, the pattern of adaptation looks thin. Analysts who track Russian military innovation closely describe most of what Russia is doing as tactical improvisation rather than systemic change, small fixes bolted onto an army that hasn't rebuilt its underlying approach. We did see one attempt at something bigger, an armored assault built around active drone jamming, but by most accounts it did not perform well enough to change the equation. Put simply, Ukraine has built a repeatable system that turns almost any stretch of the front into a trap. Russia has not found a systemic answer to that system, which means that even mobilizing more troops mostly just means feeding more people into the same traps faster. So why does Russia keep attacking into a wall that clearly isn't moving? Part of the answer is uncomfortable and almost darkly funny. There's growing evidence that Russian units are increasingly relying on staged and digitally manipulated footage to report success up the chain of command, footage overlaid onto real terrain to simulate a presence that doesn't actually exist. One widely circulated clip appeared to show a soldier planting a flag in captured territory, until viewers noticed the bushes around him were actually full-grown trees, meaning the figure had been artificially scaled to fit into real drone footage. It's a small, almost absurd detail, but it points to something structural. A command culture that rewards reported success over verified success creates exactly this kind of feedback loop. Officers under pressure produce convincing-looking proof of progress. That proof gets rewarded regardless of what's actually happening on the ground, and the war continues to be fought on paper even as it stalls in the mud. None of this means the war is easy or safe for Ukraine. People are still dying every single day, civilians and soldiers alike, and that cost is real no matter how the broader trend lines are moving. Supporting Ukraine's armed forces materially remains one of the most direct ways to shorten that suffering and to make sure this year's momentum doesn't get squandered. But strategically, when you step back from the day-to-day noise and look at casualties, territory, fortifications, and the widening gap between what Russia claims and what Russia can prove, the conclusion holds. Russia set out to break Ukraine's defensive lines in 2026. Instead, it has spent a year running its army into a wall it built for itself. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time.